Hello, my name is David Wells and I am delighted to be invited by Red Deer Catholic to come and work with you this morning on your Faith Day. And I'm speaking to you from the south coast of England, from my kitchen. And obviously what I want to do is begin by saying a really big thank you to you over the years, for those of you who know me, for inviting me to your part of the world. And to thank Leanne particularly, and to Chris for their help in preparing these videos. They've helped me to prepare them. So a big heartfelt thank you for this opportunity, and to say how much I wish I was a little bit closer to you than I am right now. However, this will do. And this year, Leanne has invited me to, in the year in which your theme is to trust in the Lord with all your heart, you're focusing particularly, I think, on the faith goals of hospitality and justice. And how right you are, because this is the year in which we stand in the shadow of Pope Francis's most recent encyclical. Don't worry about that. If you don't know what an encyclical is, ask somebody. But basically this document that he's written, which is all about the need for fraternity, that we become a family. So hospitality and justice are close to the heart of the Holy Father, and they're close to the issues of our day. Because you've chosen hospitality and justice, these two short videos, they're both about 15 minutes long. You know, they're quite challenging, but don't be put off by this, because there's nothing here to make you feel guilty and there's nothing here to oppress you, but get ready for a challenge, all right? Because you've picked a challenging theme. And so for that reason, Red Deer Catholic, I would like to propose that before you do much more work on this, you line up for yourself a certain treat. This is called a Belgian bun where we live. I don't know what you call it, but they're delicious. And when I'm doing work that's challenging, I often like to have in the background somewhere a little bit of a treat, because I know I'm going to have to work hard. And that's what this morning is all about, you know, two short videos to reflect on some pretty meaty themes. So don't lose your sense of humour, and make sure you've got something with a treat in lined up. Is that all right? See, I'm potty. I am completely mad. And by the way, from time to time, my dog may well be making an appearance, because it sits where it wants to. So let's move swiftly on to these two remarkable themes that you've chosen, faith goals of hospitality and justice, in the wake of Pope Francis's document called Fratelli tutti. I love saying that. Fratelli tutti, meaning brothers, sisters, all. The basic tenet of this document is that we have to move from being strangers to being family. That's our destiny. That's the call of the church, and that's the purpose of your school, that we move from being strangers to being family. Fratelli tutti, brothers, sisters, all. So, where did this document come from? And in the second video, we'll explore how to apply it, all right? So, in order to enjoy this document, you have to begin with a bit of a question, and it's a personal challenge, right? And the question is, what is the lens through which you assess people? You know what I mean, don't you? You know, I don't mean how good are they at your subject, you know, or how academic are they. I mean, really, how do we work out even whether we like someone? What are our categories? What do we find impressive? What do we find admirable? And also, what disturbs us? These questions are critical, because at the heart of this document, and the heart of your faith theme, is a critical question. Who do I include? And who do I exclude? And I know that probably most of us do our best not to exclude anybody, but somehow some people don't get invited. So, what happened to Pope Francis that made him write a document all about this? Fratelli tutti. Why? Well, I'm going to take you back to the year 1219. 1219, quite a long time ago. And in 1219, Saint Francis is heading barefoot across Europe to meet the Sultan. And he's going to meet the Sultan, Malik al-Kamil, in Egypt. And he's making this pilgrimage, but in quite a strange time. You see, he's going with the Crusades. And the Crusade, the Fifth Crusade, is taking up arms. It's hard to imagine that we would fight with sword for the gospel. It's hard to get into that mindset. But Francis is travelling with this army. And as they head to Egypt, he's going to meet the Sultan, a senior person in the Muslim world. And the two of them are going to meet. And when they meet, something quite remarkable happens. We're told, historians tell us, they're noted, these exchanges. We're told that they begin with dispute and an attempt to persuade the other. And they're sort of at loggerheads, trying to persuade each other about who's right, and they're sort of getting nowhere. And then something quite remarkable happens during the discourse. You know what happens, don't you? They start to like each other. Isn't that annoying? When the people we prefer to call enemies turn out to be kind, attractive, helpful people. Then what do we do with our prejudices and our misconceptions and our preconceptions? Oh, it's so irritating. Through humility, openness and dialogue, these two men begin to call each other brothers. A head senior in the Islam world calling the Pope a brother. Remarkable. And why is that remarkable? Well, 800 years later, Pope Francis, in the footsteps of Saint Francis, travels to Abu Dhabi, where he goes there to meet Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayyib, the Grand Imam. And there the two of them spend time together. They grow in admiration for each other. They do exactly as Saint Francis did. And they write a document together. We could talk about that another time. And they sign it. And they describe each other as brothers. Huge differences in culture, in creed, even in their very demeanour. They're different to each other. They're different personalities. There's nothing alike about these two people except their goodness. And they become brothers. And for Pope Francis, this begins to shape the document he's going to write, Fratelli tutti. He goes back to the teaching of Saint Francis, and he says, you know, that Saint Francis taught his brothers within the monastery, when you find yourself amongst non-believers, no more shouting, no more arguing. Don't enter into arguments and disputes. Rather, without losing who you are, subjugate, make yourself subject to one another in humility and in openness and in dialogue. So much so that St. John Paul II, years later, says it's in this dialogue that we can find out who we are. Ouch! Isn't it more tempting to surround yourself with people who look like you, sound like you, and agree with you, and then form a holy huddle of the like-minded, and then at least you can decide that we're okay? But for Pope Francis, the very act of staying young depends on our openness, our humility, with dialogue, to engaging with people who are different to us. He says, you know, they will help to keep us young. The alternative is that we become a little bit frozen in our own ways, and then dismissive, and then we end up in a world of people who are in and people who are out, people who are like me and people who I disagree with. Because the risk of that is that we stop learning, because we simply create a world that's a mirror of ourselves. St. John Paul II wrote it like this. He says, while keeping our identity intact, Christians must be prepared to learn and to receive from and through others the positive values of their traditions. And that through this dialogue, he writes, we may be moved to give up ingrained prejudices, to revise preconceived ideas, and even sometimes, he writes, to allow the understanding of our faith to be purified by others. Brothers and sisters all, see, it matters to him. Now there's a third influence on this remarkable document. And this time I don't want to take you quite so far back as to the Middle Ages. What I'd rather do is take you back to March 27th of last year. In fact, shortly before that, I was with you in Red Deer. Oh, it doesn't seem like a year ago. And on March the 27th, 2020, Pope Francis gives what's called an Urbi et Orbi blessing. It's not something he does often. An Urbi et Orbi blessing. What is that? That's a blessing for the world and a blessing for the church. A blessing for Rome and a blessing for the universal. All right? An Urbi et Orbi blessing. Except something is really different. On March the 27th, you can Google this. All right? Pope Francis, blessing, March 27th, St. Peter's Square. What's happening? It's amazing. He's giving this blessing. And if you look at the images of it, no one is there. Not a soul. Completely empty, but for the people filming, one or two bystanders. What's important about this document is that at this point, Pope Francis, in his blessing, suggests we are in a storm. The pandemic. But the pandemic has done more than wrought havoc and disrupted and interrupted and bruised our lives. The pandemic, he says, has opened up old wounds. We now live in a world, he said, that is becoming fractured, more nationalistic, a world of a culture of wall building. It's interesting because although it sounds bleak, what he's really saying is we are hurting. We're in a storm. We're surrounded by dark clouds. And in this time, we seem to have become more tense, more anxious and more fractured than ever. Why does that matter? Well, if you read Fratelli, tutti, his most recent encyclical, his first chapter, which sounds very bleak, is called Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. Dark clouds over a closed world, the pandemic. But in this, he describes a world in which people have become more self-absorbed, self-obsessed, more nationalistic. He describes a culture of a fracture of collaboration, where people have become very nationalistic and intrinsically attuned to their own concerns and their own needs. He describes a world in which there are 26 million refugees at this time. People whose lives have become so unbearable that they would travel with nothing to live somewhere else. Could you imagine how bad something's got to get before you put your possessions in a carrier bag and start walking? The culture of wars, he said, has led to an exposure of old tensions. We're beginning to regard, he says, the stranger as a threat. And for that reason, he calls upon the church to explore fraternity, particularly the call to justice and hospitality. And in part 2 of these 2 videos, we're going to look particularly at those, the challenges they present and the opportunities. Why? Well, Pope Francis says in the document, really, those great Western ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity. What does he say? He says liberty, freedom and equality, justice, won't happen until we regard each other as brothers, sisters, all. It's a great document. It's quite heavy going, but it's worth a read sometime. So what I want to do, if you don't mind, is finish with a couple of questions. Okay, number one, going back to that question about a lens. How do we decide, maybe vaguely decide, not intellectually, but how do we decide who's invited to our table? Who do we welcome? And be honest, don't beat yourself up, but who's welcome in your life? I mean, by that I don't mean who do you intellectually welcome, I mean, who's there? Who's even in your life? Is there much diversity? Is your life filled with people who would agree with you? I know mine is. And then lastly, if you can be honest with yourself, just a little bit of an examination of your conscience, who do we distance ourselves from? Who have we decided about before really understanding? Who are we tempted to prejudge? Don't feel guilty. Just dare to go there and paint an honest picture, just briefly. Nobody comes out of this particularly well, and in part 2 we'll look at how to respond to this, but right now, maybe, let's just think about it. In our lives, who's in, who's out? Even subtly, who's in and who's out? Thanks for listening, and I'll be back with part 2 in just a minute.